Welcome and hello everyone. I am going to introduce you to discourse analysis today. We are going to focus on the introduction to discourse analysis and important concepts and terms, inshallah. As I mentioned in class today, discourse is such a broad concept, and according to Grasser and friends, discourse is what makes a human. This makes sense because discourse is everywhere. Discourse identifies and describes written, spoken, and visual communications. And of course, that's what makes us human when we interact, when we communicate in any form of communication, be it spoken, written, or visual. Um, in British research, the term discourse is frequently used synonymously with text, that is authentic, everyday linguistic communication. While in France, they focus on the connection between language and thought. Example, meaning creation and societal maintenance of complex knowledge system. Well, in Germany, in functional pragmatics, discourse is structured sets of speech acts. And it may also be interesting to know how the Austrians, for example, define discourse, how the Italian um, um, view discourse in their research, or perhaps how Malaysian discourse scholars treat discourse in their research. This is something that you may want to look up for or perhaps find out just to make sense of how the term is used differently in different settings by different scholars. Yeah. But the question is, if it is so hard to define discourse succinctly, how are we going to decide what we're going to analyze? Because, discourse is called discourse analysis. Like we're doing discourse analysis and there is no one definition of discourse. So what um, is it exactly that we will be analyzing in this class for first semester in this course? What is discourse analysis and what is discourse? And why do you think different research define discourse so differently? Why can't they just settle with one definition of discourse? Why do they make life so difficult? Any guess? Right, so the answer lies in the fact that the study of discourse, okay, as I mentioned today in class, does not exclusively belong to the field of linguistics. Okay, it's not exclusively linguistics, discourse analysis, or critical discourse analysis. They could belong to any of these branches of knowledge, and each branch would have different theoretical orientation, methodological orientation, as they are likely to differ in the sources they refer to, their school of thoughts, for example. Um, their theoretical underpinnings or background, and also to some extent in the problem and research questions which they set out to investigate. So in each and every field that you can see here, would have what they call discourse analysis. But of course, the way discourse analysis is set out is different depending on school of thought, the theoretical, methodological underpinning or background, and problems, research questions that they set out to investigate. Okay, so cool. But the big question is, again, where do we begin? Which field do we need to follow? Which school of thought do we need to adopt when we do our own discourse analysis? It's the big question. So over the years, scholars have approached the study of discourse in many different ways. People who analyze discourse have basically gone about it from three different perspectives, based on three different views, three different ideas about what discourse is. And the first one, we have the formal view of looking at discourse, and we have scholars like Zalik Harris. So Zalik Harris is the first linguist who coined the term discourse analysis in 1952. And formalists define discourse as language above the level of clause or sentence, and they would somehow focus on rules and conventions, um, basically linguistic features, words and grammar, overall pattern of text and conversation, coherence and cohesion in a nutshell. And then we have functional view of looking at discourse, and we have scholars or linguists like Widdowson, Halliday. Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with at least Halliday. Okay, so functionalists define discourse as language in use, and they focus on text in context, basically how people use language to do things and how we interpret what other people are trying to do when they speak or write or signal. Okay, and lastly, we have the social view of looking at discourse, and scholars like Michel Foucault. The socialists define discourse as a kind of social practice in which they would focus on the way we construct different social identities, relationships, and worldview. So basically, the socialists would go beyond that and include a broader context like historical, sociological, anthropological context of that particular text under investigation. Okay. So let's look at formal aspect of discourse in a bit more detail. So Zalik Harris is the American linguist who first introduced the term discourse analysis as a way of analyzing connected speech and writing. So when he first started, he had two main interests. The first one is to examine language beyond the level of sentence. And the second one is to see the relationship between linguistic and non-linguistic behavior, basically the paralinguistics elements of the text. Okay, but he only focused on the first one, the former, which is on the different elements of text or conversations, the rules and conventions of text, as can be seen explicitly in the text. His aim was to provide a way for describing how language features are distributed within text and the way in which they are combined in particular kind and style of text. So the method that Harris proposed for the analysis of discourse during that time is called distributional analysis or grammatical analysis. I think, yeah, so distributional analysis was not much different from how people go about doing grammatical analysis. So that's why people see the formal aspect of discourse as grammatical analysis, basically. Okay, because the formal approach focuses on linguistic features, words and grammar, which help to link different parts of text or conversation together and how pieces of text are stuck together. And that is what we call cohesion. And overall patterns or sequence or of elements in a text or a conversation, kinds of text interactions ought to be structured, which also can be called as coherence. So these are the focus on the formal view of this course. And when you do formal analysis, you basically do grammatical analysis. You analyze the grammatical elements, the rules and conventions that you can see that is explicitly stated in the text. Okay. Right, so here is one example. They Are Us by Jacinda Ardern on the 15th of March 2019. So why don't you put this video on pause for 1 or 2 or 3 minutes before you come back and see whether you are able to do the formal analysis. Okay, so if you get they, okay, as the third person pronoun, okay, and us as the first person pronoun, and are as relational process identifying, okay, as A is the identity of X, okay, You are absolutely correct, and this is how you would do your formal analysis when you analyze your text or discourse. Okay, you basically just identify the different linguistic element in the utterance or text or discourse. Okay, first view of language, formal analysis. So if you think that the previous example doesn't really make sense, you're right, because it is often difficult to understand what a piece of language means without referring to the social context in which it is being used and what the person who is doing it or using it is trying to do with the utterance, the text, or discourse. That's why we have this functional aspect of discourse. It grew out of the work of number of important scholars. For example, we have H.G. Widdowson. He approached the whole problem of language use from the perspective of language learning, noting that learning a foreign language requires more than just learning how to make grammatical sentences, because it also involves being able to use the language to accomplish things in the world. And M.K. Halliday, I'm sure you're familiar with him. He approached to study of grammar very different than formal approach. Basically, he focused less on the forms of language, focused less on the structure of language, and takes more on the social functions accomplished by language. And John Austin, Paul Grice laid the foundation for what we call pragmatics, how people do things with language. And that is basically what we're going to do in the functional analysis. When we look at discourse using this functional perspective, we basically look at text in context, okay? Because how people actually use language to get things done is very much related, it's very much linked to specific context. And because we know that language is not produced in a vacuum, context is important to make sense of language. If not, it's hard to make sense of something, or perhaps it will lead to misunderstanding of certain utterance, text, or discourse. Okay. So the question now is, what is context? Because a text creates no sense in itself, but only in connection with knowledge of the world and of the text itself, of course. And the meaning is unclear when context is lacking, and it's very disturbing to some extent. So context is an inherent part of discourse analysis. It contributes significantly to how systematically it can be applied as part of interdisciplinary approaches in the case of discourse analysis. So in the course of investigating complex social problems, it is necessary to draw on multiple theoretical approaches to analyze given context and relate this to text. So basically, in other words, when you do your discourse analysis, you cannot just focus on one context. You have to always refer or co-refer and cross-reference one context to the other in order to make sense of the issue being discussed in your text or discourse and whatnot. Okay. But yes, you are also right if you think that context is such a broad concept, because it could mean practically anything from the place and time of day of an utterance to the color of the clothing that the speakers are wearing, the speaker's political views, or religious belief, for example. Context is also the structural constraints and norms, time and space, cognitive perceptions of a given situation by writers, speakers, readers, viewers, and listeners. It can be practically everything. Okay, and that is something that you have to think about as an analyst, like what element of context that is appropriate to be included in your analysis of any particular text or discourse, and whether context is included as part of your linguistic analysis, be it formal or functional, social, and the definition of context per se are dependent on your prior theoretical decision and your own decision basically as the analyst of any particular discourse or text. Okay? And of course, you may ask, how do you, as a discourse analysis, figure out which aspect of context are relevant? And how do people involved figure this out? Do you have any guess? Okay, so why don't you just like put this video on pause again for 1 or 2 minutes to think about it before we discuss the answers. Right, okay. So the idea that the meaning of utterances depends on the context in which they are produced can be traced back to the anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski and his 1923 paper, The Problem of Meaning in Primitive Languages. So he argues that we can understand the words spoken by members of societies very different from our own, though through mere translation. Okay, we must also have understanding of the situation in which the words were spoken and the significance of various relationships and activities in that situation to the speakers. And yeah, so you have to understand what is likely that you want to understand, or what is likely that you want to get out of that discourse or text or your own analysis, and you have to figure it out. And and once you know the situation that you need to um, consider, okay, when you do your own analysis, inshallah, you'll be able to choose like which element of discourse is relevant to your analysis. Okay, and it's very important to remember that if one element is relevant to one analyst or your friend, it may not be relevant to you, and it's totally fine. Okay, it depends on what you want to find, or what you want to get out of the text under investigation. Okay, so now let's look at some ways to study language in use, okay, especially when it comes to the functional view of looking at discourse. So basically, when we say that we're going to study the language in use, we basically consider discourse itself as a kind of action. I think I did mention this in our class just now, where we are not just a noun, we are very much verbs. Okay, we represent our identity, who we are, based on what we do instead of only what we claim we are. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So in contrast with Foucault abstract notion in the tradition of Wittgenstein language game and Austin speech acts, for example, discourse is mainly understood as linguistic action. May be written, visual, or oral communication, verbal or non-verbal, undertaken by specific social actors in a specific setting, determined by social rules, norms, and conventions. So discourse as linguistic action explores how when we say things or write things, we are actually doing things like apologizing, promising, threatening, or making requests. So we have to consider the role of discourse in certain kinds of activities and to examine how different kinds of discourse make certain kinds of actions. Okay, how different kinds of discourse make certain kind of activities either easier or more difficult to perform. So consider how people use discourse strategically, okay, to try to communicate their interpretation of a situation or to manage their relationship with the people with whom they are communicating and whatnot. So basically, when you say something, yeah, you are not only okay. For example, if you take Jacinda Ardern's utterance just now, like you are as we are not only she's um I mean, the idea of using that utterance, it's not only to declare that you are part of it, but there are other agendas, other missions or aims that she's trying to achieve at the same time. And that is something that we have to understand when we analyze any text, any discourse. You don't look at it only on the surface, but try to um, understand the internalized objective of aim of any specific utterance or text or discourse. So let's look at the examples. Again, they are as first, perhaps we can establish context. Okay, so right now, just now we look at these utterance from that formal view of the view of discourse, where we identified they as the third person pronoun or relational process identifying X is Y, and us as the first person pronoun, plural pronoun. So now, in order to be able to do the functional analysis, okay, you have to include context, because functional analysis is all about looking at text in context, language use. Okay, so why don't you take 2 or 3 minutes to build out or to construct the context of this utterance. Okay, if you know what happened in 15th of March 2019 and who Jacinda Ardern is, that would be easier for you, inshallah. So we're talking about the 15th of March 2019, basically talking about the Christchurch mosque shootings, where there were two consecutive terrorist shooting attacks at mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand during Friday prayer. And the terrorists live streamed the first attack on Facebook Live. The attacks, I think, killed 51 people and injured 49. And the terrorist was described in media report as white supremacists, and part of the alternate right, was arrested and initially charged with one murder. So he was later charged with 51 murders, 40 attempted murder, and engaging in a terrorist act. He pleaded not guilty though to all charges, with the trial expected to start um, in May 2020, but perhaps during the because of the pandemic, they postponed that trial. So yes, that's basically, I think, for me as the analyst. Okay, that would give me enough context to analyze that very simple utterance by Jacinda Ardern on that particular day when it happened. Okay. Right, so as you can see here is the formal analysis of the utterance they are is that we did earlier. So we identified there as the third person pronoun, or we use transitive analysis to identify, or as a relational process, identifying as in A is the identity of X and us as the first person pronoun. So basically this is the formal analysis, and if you want to analyze these grammatical items, well, analyze the functions of these grammatical items, we have to do it in context of the utterance, in context of the text, or in context of the discourse. So here's the functional explanation. They and presupposes two different identities, cultures, religions, etc. Like, okay, we have two separate social groups, one the they, the other one the us. Okay, so we presuppose, presupposition pragmatic, we presuppose that these two social groups have different identities, have different cultures, have different religions, etc. Okay, basically us versus them. And the relational process identifying here, okay, when you use all there, relational process identifying X is the identity of A, or A is the identity of X. Okay, you can come up with your own formula. Closes, okay, closes a gap between the dichotomy of us and them. Okay, of these two different social groups, a division or contrast between two things, two groups, okay, that are or are represented as being opposed or entirely different to one another. So basically, Jacinda Ardern's New Zealand's Prime Minister declarative statement, okay, we use speech act there, is a manifestation. It is not only just a declaration, okay, that you are us, but it's also a manifestation of inclusivity and solidarity. Okay, so that is how you analyze the functional view of the utterance. Okay, right. So now we have the final view of looking at discourse, which is the social aspect of discourse. So basically, to the socialists like Michel Foucault, and he's not a linguist, he consider the role of language in social practice. Okay, so basically language is not seen not just as a system for making meaning, but as part of larger system through which people construct social identities and, of course, social realities. And Michel Foucault argues that discourse is the main tool in which people or in which we construct knowledge and exert power over other people. Okay. And of course, different kind of discourses or discourse are associated with different kinds of people and different systems of knowledge. For example, we have clinical discourse, which is associated most probably with the doctors, those in the medical field, the discourse of natural history, psychiatric discourse, economic discourse, and whatnot. So we have like specific setting, specific people, and specific discourse. Okay. So talking about discourse with small d, small letter d, and discourse with the capital D, it's very important for you to understand the differences between these two. So James Paul G, 1999, uses a capital D to distinguish different views of discourse. Okay, and the small letter d as mass noun, basically language in use. So mass noun is noun denoting something that cannot be counted, substance or quality. As mass noun, language in use, um, he basically refers to any stretch of language, spoken, written, or sign, or visual, which hangs together to make sense to some community of people who use that language. Okay, making sense is always a social and variable matter. That is one thing that we have to remember. What makes sense to one community of people may not make sense to another, and what makes sense to me might not make sense to you, just as what makes sense to you might not make sense to me, because we doesn't only belong to one community, and that is one thing that you have to remember. We belong to many different communities. Well, of course, we share the same UIA community, but not neighborhood community, or perhaps academic community and something like that. So that is something we have to remember. That's why we need to have context. And as count now, okay, plural, we can have plural discourses, form of life. Um, he says that it's a socially accepted association among ways of which language, um, the symbolic expressions and artifacts of thinking, feeling, believing, valuing, and acting that can be used to identify oneself as a member of a socially meaningful group or social network. Okay, so these courses with that capital D are always ways of being in the world or forms of life which integrate words, acts, values, belief, attitudes, and social identities together. So the latter aspect of discourse, that is discourse as count noun, or discourses as mass noun, okay, lead us to explore how people use language to advance certain version of reality and certain relationships of power, and also how our belief, values, and social institutions are constructed through and supported by discourse. Okay, so a central principle of this view of discourse is that discourse is always ideological. That is, discourse always has an agenda, but it always ends up serving interests of certain people over those of others. Okay. So here, if we look at it from the social context or social analysis, okay, using the same example, we know that Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, person with power, person with authority, because she's the Prime Minister, is promoting against racism, white supremacist agenda. So us, the native of New Zealand, versus them, the immigrants, the Muslims, okay. Um, the gap between these two are being closed using by identifying that they are also part of it, would somehow promote solidarity and inclusivity in that country, or within that different communities. Okay. Right, so that's cool, but the big question is, where do we begin? Which perspective or approach should we adopt or adapt? Okay, so do you want to take like 30 seconds to think about this, like, which perspective that you would adopt, okay, when you do your own analysis. You're right if you think that you should always include, all three of them. It means you pay attention to my lecture. So thank you. So yes, you have to take into account all three perspectives: formal, functional, as well as social analysis, views of looking at discourse. Because it is hard to look at discourse in a meaningful way from only one of these perspectives. For example, if you just focus on the formal view of looking at discourse. So basically, when you do your analysis, it's just going to give me a grammatical analysis of your text. So that wouldn't make your analysis discourse analysis. It would make your analysis as grammatical analysis, and that is not ENGL 4635 is all about. Or if you just give me the functional analysis of a text, basically you just give me the interpretation of the text without giving me any linguistic evidence that you can get if you do the formal analysis, then that is also not ENGL 4635. It's not discourse analysis. If you just focus on the interpretation of the text. Okay, that might be very subjective, and of course, this is not an interpretation class. Or just give me social analysis of certain texts. Again, that is not discourse analysis. Okay, so simply looking at how texts are put together, for example, may be interesting, of course, and convenient to some extent, but it has limited practical value. At the same time, you cannot really make broad statement about power and ideology in a text without first understanding some basic things about how text is put together and how people are actually using it in specific social contexts to perform special actions. So the way people use language cannot really be separated from the way it is put together. I mean, we have established this in our first meeting today, and the way people use language to show who they are and what they believe cannot be separated from the things people are using language to do in particular situations according to Jones. So remember, when you give me your analysis, okay, of any text, remember to include all three different perspectives into your analysis, okay? And finally, what matters in ENGL 4635 discourse analysis? And I'll show you. Okay, first of all, of course, because we're dealing with text discourse, what matters would be the text itself. And the text that you would use in your analysis later can be spoken, it can be written, it can be visual or signal. Okay, you have to understand what makes a text, what makes a genre a genre, and it can be in in any form, whether it's spoken, it can be written, visual or signal, or in any genre that you are interested in. And of course, the issues or topics are also very important when you want to do discourse analysis, because again, as I remind you so many times, I think today, we don't deal with made-up sentences. We deal with real language, real everyday communication or text. And of course, discourse is also very important because what discourse analysis without discourse. Well, of course, like in England, they equate discourse as text, but it depends on how you see it. Some people or some scholars would think text as smaller than discourse. That we have discourse, and in that discourse we have text. So it depends on how you want to see it. Okay, either way is fine. So yes, we focus on the product. So basically, discourse, text, issues, topics are the product of of certain producers. Can be a single person, or it can be like an institution or a group of people, the producers. Yeah. Um, so yeah, of course, the producer can be the speaker, the writer, the drawer, or designer. Can be institution or organization, as I mentioned. And you have to remember that the producer of a text or would have different cultures. You have different belief, their own identity, agenda, values, worldview, ideology, messages, etc., as well as situational environment that you should take into account when you analyze the product of this producer of the product, which is the text, the discourse, the issues, topics that come from these producers. Okay. And all these elements are what we call context as well. Okay, historical, political, sociological context within the parameter of that discourse, and of course the producer. Okay. But in ENGL 4635, okay, we can only focus on producer and discourse instead of the receiver, because we don't have the capacity to do that, because basically if you want to analyze the perception of those who receive the product. Okay, you would have to go out and conduct interviews, surveys and whatnot, but of course with the limitation of 14 or 12-week semester, we don't have time to do that, so we're just going to focus on producer and product. Okay. So if you come to me later for your term paper, for example, later, don't include objectives like to understand the perception of the receivers of certain issues or products or text or discourse and whatnot, to understand the effect of how discourse or certain discourse affect certain people, community and whatnot. I mean, that can be done if you have more time, but not in the limited 12 or 14-week semester. Okay. All right. I think that's it for this lecture. We'll continue in the next lecture, inshallah. So with this, I hope you'll be able to complete your worksheet number 1 with your partner. If you have any questions, as usual, just you can always email me 24/7, or if it's urgent, you can always WhatsApp me. I'll see you later, inshallah. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.